What happens when one of Hollywood's most intense actors meets a talk show host who refuses to show basic respect? Tonight we dive into the explosive confrontation that left Tom Hardy walking off Jimmy Kimmel Live. And trust me, what unfolded behind those cameras will shock you. The tension was palpable from the moment Hardy stepped onto that stage, but nobody could have predicted how quickly things would spiral out of control. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, telling us what you think about celebrity interviews gone wrong. The atmosphere in the Jimmy Kimmel Live studio was electric, as Tom Hardy made his entrance, but not for the reasons you might expect. The British actor, known for his intense roles in films like Mad Max and Venom, had agreed to appear on the show to promote his latest project. But what started as a routine interview quickly became something much more sinister. As Hardy took his seat across from Kimmel, the host's demeanor was noticeably different from his usual cheerful persona. There was an underlying tension that seemed to permeate the entire set, and those who were present that night would later describe the atmosphere as uncomfortable from the very beginning. Kimmel opened the interview with what appeared to be a standard question about Hardy's upcoming film, but his tone carried an edge that immediately put the actor on guard. "So, Tom, I have to ask, do you actually understand what you're saying half the time in these movies? Or do you just mumble through your lines and hope for the best?" The question was delivered with Kimmel's signature smirk, but there was something more calculated behind it, something that suggested this wasn't just playful banter. Hardy's jaw tightened slightly, but he maintained his composure, responding with his characteristic British politeness. "I think audiences connect with authenticity, Jimmy. When you're portraying a character, especially one who's been through trauma or difficult circumstances, sometimes the way they speak reflects that experience. It's not about mumbling, it's about truth." Hardy's response was measured, but those who knew him well could see the storm brewing behind his eyes. He had dealt with critics questioning his speech patterns before, but there was something particularly dismissive about Kimmel's approach that seemed designed to provoke rather than entertain. Kimmel wasn't finished, though. He leaned back in his chair with an exaggerated laugh that felt forced and theatrical. Right, authenticity. I mean, I guess that's one way to put it. But come on, Tom, even your fans joke about needing subtitles for your movies. Don't you think there's a point where authenticity becomes, well, incomprehensible?" The audience laughed nervously, sensing the uncomfortable dynamic between the two men. Hardy's publicist, sitting in the green room, was already reaching for her phone, recognizing the warning signs of an interview going sideways. The British actor shifted in his seat, his famous intensity beginning to surface. "I think you're confusing authenticity with accessibility, Jimmy. Not everything needs to be dumbed down for mass consumption. Sometimes art challenges people, and that's not necessarily a bad thing." His voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the words. Hardy had spent years perfecting his craft, working with dialect coaches, and immersing himself completely in his characters. To have his dedication dismissed so casually was clearly striking a nerve. Kimmel sensed he was getting under Hardy's skin and decided to push further. "Dumbed down? Wow, okay. So you're saying your audience needs to be smarter to appreciate your work? That's pretty condescending, don't you think?" The host's tone was becoming more aggressive, abandoning any pretense of light-hearted celebrity chat. The camera operators exchanged glances, recognizing that this was no longer a typical late-night interview. Something was building here, and everyone in the studio could feel it. Hardy's eyes narrowed, and for the first time since sitting down, he leaned forward slightly. "That's not what I said, and I think you know that. What I said was that art doesn't always need to pander to the lowest common denominator. There's a difference between being accessible and being insulting to your audience's intelligence." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Hardy's voice took on the same menacing quality that had made him famous in films like Bronson and The Dark Knight Rises. The host's smirk faltered for just a moment before he regained his composure. Insulting to their intelligence? Like expecting them to decipher what you're actually saying? Kimmel's persistence was becoming uncomfortable even for his own audience, many of whom had come expecting the usual celebrity puff piece. Instead, they were witnessing what felt like a calculated attack on a respected actor who was simply trying to promote his work. Hardy sat back in his chair, his expression darkening. "You know, Jimmy, I came here tonight thinking we'd have a conversation about filmmaking, about the craft of acting, maybe even about the themes in my new project. Instead, you seem more interested in cheap shots and playground insults. Is this really the level of discourse we're aiming for here?" The actor's voice remained controlled, but there was an unmistakable edge to it now, a warning that Kimmel seemed determined to ignore. The host laughed again, but this time it sounded even more forced. "Hey, I'm just asking the questions that everyone's thinking. Don't shoot the messenger." But Kimmel's eyes betrayed his true intentions. This wasn't about asking tough questions or providing entertainment for his audience. This was personal, and everyone in that studio was beginning to realize it. The tension was becoming unbearable, and what had started as an uncomfortable interview was about to become something much worse. The false laughter from Kimmel hung in the air like a challenge, and Hardy's response was swift and pointed. "The questions everyone's thinking? Or the questions you've been saving up because you've got some personal issue with me?" The actor's voice had dropped to that familiar growl that audiences knew from his most intimidating roles. But this wasn't acting. This was real, raw emotion from a man who had clearly reached his limit with the host's unprofessional behavior. Kimmel's facade began to crack as he realized Hardy wasn't going to play along with his game. "Personal issue? Come on, Tom, don't be so sensitive. This is comedy, this is what we do here. Can't you take a joke?" But the host's defensive response only confirmed what Hardy had suspected. This wasn't about comedy or entertainment. This was about something deeper, something that had been festering long before the cameras started rolling. "A joke?" Hardy's voice rose slightly, his British accent becoming more pronounced as his anger mounted. "You invite me onto your show, supposedly to discuss my work, and then spend the entire time trying to humiliate me in front of your audience. That's not comedy, Jimmy. That's just cruelty dressed up as entertainment." The actor's hands gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles beginning to show white from the pressure. The audience was completely silent now, the uncomfortable energy in the room palpable. Even Kimmel's band seemed to sense that something had gone terribly wrong. The host's usual confidence was wavering, but instead of backing down or attempting to defuse the situation, he doubled down on his attack. "Humiliate you? Jesus, Tom, you really can't handle any criticism, can you? Maybe if you spoke clearly in your movies, people wouldn't have to make jokes about it." That was the moment everything changed. Hardy's composure, which had been hanging by a thread, finally snapped. He stood up from his chair with such sudden force that it rolled backward several feet. "Criticism? You call this criticism?" His voice boomed across the studio, causing several audience members to visibly flinch. "You haven't asked me a single substantive question about my work, my process, or anything related to why I'm actually here. Instead, you've spent 10 minutes trying to tear me down for cheap laughs." Kimmel remained seated, but his body language showed he was clearly taken aback by Hardy's reaction. "Sit down, Tom. You're overreacting. This is how interviews work here." But his voice lacked conviction now, and everyone could hear the uncertainty creeping in. The host had pushed too far and he knew it, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it. "Overreacting?" Hardy's laugh was bitter and humorless. "I've been respectful, I've been professional, and I've tried to answer your questions honestly despite their obvious intent to mock me. But you know what, Jimmy? I don't have to sit here and take this abuse just because you have a camera pointed at me." The actor began moving toward the edge of the interview area, his intention clear. The host finally stood up, perhaps realizing that his guest was serious about leaving. "Come on, don't be ridiculous. Sit back down and let's finish the interview." Like adults. But Kimmel's tone was condescending, treating Hardy like a child having a tantrum rather than a professional who had been subjected to unprovoked hostility. Hardy stopped in his tracks and turned back to face Kimmel, his eyes blazing with anger. Like adults? You want to talk about acting like adults? An adult doesn't invite someone onto their show just to humiliate them. An adult doesn't hide behind the excuse of comedy when they're being deliberately cruel. And an adult certainly doesn't tell someone they're overreacting when they've been nothing but disrespectful from the moment the cameras started rolling. The studio was dead silent except for the hum of the cameras and lighting equipment. Even the production crew had stopped what they were doing to watch the confrontation unfold. Kimmel's face was flushed now, whether from embarrassment or anger. It was hard to tell. You know what, Tom? Maybe you should leave. Maybe this show isn't the right fit for someone with your, let's call it, temperament. Hardy's response was immediate and cutting. My temperament? You mean my refusal to be your punching bag for entertainment? You mean my expectation that I'd be treated with basic human decency? If that's a temperament problem, then yes, I absolutely have one. The actor's voice carried across the studio with such intensity that even the security personnel were beginning to pay attention. I've worked with directors, actors, and crews all over the world, Hardy continued, his voice never wavering. I've done interviews with journalists who asked tough questions, challenging questions, questions that made me think and pushed me to give better answers. But you know what they all had in common, Jimmy? They treated me with respect. They understood that an interview is supposed to be a conversation, not a public execution. Kimmel's response revealed just how deep his unprofessionalism ran. Oh, spare me the lecture about respect. You're the one who came on my show and couldn't handle a little ribbing. Maybe if you weren't so uptight, you'd understand that this is all in good fun. But his words rang hollow in the tense atmosphere of the studio, and even his own audience seemed unconvinced by his justification. The word uptight seemed to be the final straw for Hardy, who took a step closer to Kimmel's desk, his presence suddenly filling the space between them with an almost physical intensity. Uptight? You think standing up for myself when someone is deliberately trying to embarrass me makes me uptight? Let me tell you something, Jimmy. I've dealt with real criticism, real challenges, real adversity in my life and career. What you're doing here isn't any of those things. It's just playground bullying with a bigger audience. Kimmel's discomfort was now obvious to everyone in the studio, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. Bullying? Are you kidding me right now? You're a grown man, Tom. Act like it. This is television. This is entertainment. If you can't handle a few jokes, maybe you shouldn't be in this business. The host's voice had risen to match Hardy's intensity. But where Hardy's anger came from a place of justified frustration, Kimmel's seemed desperate and defensive. Handle a few jokes? Hardy's voice was now at a volume that made everyone in the studio acutely aware of just how intimidating the actor could be when provoked. You haven't made a single joke, Jimmy. You've made a series of personal attacks disguised as humor. There's a difference between comedy and cruelty, and apparently you've never learned it. The actor's physical presence seemed to grow even more imposing as he spoke, his years of playing intimidating characters lending weight to his words. The host's facade was crumbling completely now. Personal attacks? What personal attacks? I made a few comments about your speech patterns. That's hardly personal. But Kimmel's attempt to minimize his behavior only seemed to enrage Hardy further. The actor's face was flushed with anger, and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. A few comments? Hardy's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than his earlier shouting. You've spent the last 15 minutes systematically trying to undermine my professionalism, my talent, and my intelligence. You've insulted my work, mocked my craft, and dismissed my responses as if I'm some kind of joke. And now you want to pretend it was all innocent fun? The production crew was now actively signaling to each other, clearly concerned about how far this confrontation might escalate. Several security personnel had moved closer to the interview area, though they seemed uncertain about how to handle a situation involving two public figures in front of a live audience. Kimmel noticed their movement and seemed to take it as encouragement to continue his aggressive stance. "You know what, Tom? I think you need to calm down before you do something you'll regret. This is my show. This is my studio. And if you can't handle the heat, then maybe you should get out of the kitchen." Kimmel's words were clearly intended as a final provocation, a last attempt to maintain some semblance of control over the situation he had created. Hardy's response was swift and devastating. "Your show? Your studio? You think that gives you the right to treat people however you want? You think that makes it acceptable to humiliate guests who come here in good faith?" The actor took another step forward, and now the physical distance between them was minimal. "Let me explain something to you, Jimmy. I didn't come here to be your entertainment. I came here as a professional courtesy, to promote my work and have a conversation with someone I thought was a fellow professional. But you've shown me exactly what kind of person you really are." The host's bravado was completely gone now, replaced by visible nervousness, as he found himself face to face with one of Hollywood's most intense actors, in full fury. "Tom, you need to step back. You're making everyone uncomfortable." But Kimmel's attempt to shift the blame to Hardy's behavior only highlighted his own complete lack of accountability for the situation he had created. "I'm making everyone uncomfortable?" Hardy's laugh was sharp and bitter. "I'm not the one who turned what should have been a professional interview into a personal attack session. I'm not the one who decided that insulting a guest was more important than doing my job properly, and I'm certainly not the one who thinks that having a television show gives me the right to treat people like garbage." The tension in the studio had reached a breaking point. Hardy stood there for a moment looking at Kimmel with complete disgust before making his decision. "You know what, Jimmy? You're absolutely right about one thing. I should get out of here, not because I can't handle your pathetic attempts at humor, but because I have too much respect for myself to waste another second in the presence of someone who clearly has none for others." With that, Hardy turned and walked toward the exit, his departure as commanding as his presence had been throughout the confrontation. Kimmel, perhaps realizing the magnitude of what had just happened, made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Tom, come on, don't leave like this. We can start over, have a real conversation about your work." Hardy paused at the edge of the stage and turned back one final time. "You had your chance for a real conversation, Jimmy. You chose this instead. That's on you, not me." And with those words, he disappeared backstage, leaving Kimmel standing alone in front of his stunned audience and crew. The silence that followed was deafening. Kimmel stood there for several long seconds, seemingly unsure of how to proceed, before finally addressing his audience with a forced smile that fooled no one. "Well, folks, I guess we'll have to continue without Mr. Hardy. Sometimes these things happen in live television." But his attempt at normalcy fell flat in the wake of what everyone had just witnessed. And there you have it, the complete breakdown of one of the most explosive celebrity interviews in recent memory. What did you think of Tom Hardy's reaction? Was he justified in walking off, or should he have handled it differently? Make sure to subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments below what you think really caused Jimmy Kimmel to be so hostile toward his guest that night.